Thank you again for this opportunity. And as we do in class, especially when I teach either philosophy of art or aesthetics, I issue my warning. The first warning is that there are explicit images in this talk, and the second warning is that there are 32 slides. So that should be your first clue. It's not a traditional philosophical talk with a lot of words. Words aplenty, but lots of images. I was trained in the fine arts. My undergrad and graduate degree are in fine arts, painting and printmaking. So I am an artist. And that's when I switched to philosophy with my first second aesthetics class, and did my PhD in aesthetics under George Dickey. So it's never the case that I have a purely philosophical paper. And I am also very interested in bringing in gender studies, popular culture, race studies. Oops, and I'll have to stop touching my mouse. So thank you again. Traditionally, Traditionally, art students learn to draw the unadorned human body by copying original works of art or by looking directly at a nude model in a figure drawing class. There are obvious differences between those types of perception, but even more distinctive is the recent phenomenon of artists and viewers routinely seeing paradigmatic unclothed beauty of the human physique by looking at the toned and fit bodies of contemporary elite athletes. Athletes photographed by Helmut Newton and Annie Leibovitz, images appearing in Vanity Fair, the New York Times, and Life magazines, nude Olympians in Playboy, and most recently ESPN magazine, The Body Issue, have provided us with examples of both male and female athletic beauty that are reminiscent of ancient Greek ideals in light of a changed context. Due to perceptions evolving over time, how do we view these beautiful bodies? Recent analyses of various modes of perceiving cast suspicion on basic writings in aesthetics, dating back to the 18th century, which offered us both a simplistic notion of perception, given what we now know from studies in cog sci, and a limited concept of pleasure as the accompanying sentiment of one's experience of beauty. In this paper, I will consider what draws us to perceiving beautiful bodies in art and athletics repeatedly and over time, that is informed by viewers' changing perceptions derived from recent publications in fashion and sport, the philosophy of sport, feminist film theory, and aesthetics under the ever-expanding umbrella of Somaesthetics. Not nearly as simple as aestheticians may have us believe, nuanced perception depends not only on the many changes we see when viewing men's and women's bodies, but also on the evolving cognitive framework, complete with implicit bias, such as that of a male/patriarchal gaze, that we might bring to the act of looking. Although many theorists have noted the ethical problems of elite female athletes posing nude, this essay will suggest a new strategy of viewing and argue that perceiving beautiful athletes' bodies can be best accomplished by using an athletic agency model that focuses on the performing body typical of athletic competition, not just the body to be looked at as seen in high art, pinups, and pornography. And thank you to making the poster with not my legs. Someone asked me if those were my legs. Don't I wish? These are the legs of Gail Olenikova, marathon runner, as photographed by the famous photographer Helmut Newton. Section 1, fashion and sports. Against the backdrop of ancient Greek sculpture, reclining Renaissance nudes, and innumerable creative variations on the theme of the female body through artistic movements such as Romanticism, abstract expressionism, superrealism, artists have often sought to imbue physical manifestations of a woman's body with their own ideologies of sexism, racism, and colonialism. As E.H. Gombrich famously stated in 1956, the innocent eye is a myth. In an early challenge to the dominant modes of perception within visual high art, British painter and writer John Berger appeared in Revolutionary Videos in 1972 and published a book entitled Ways of Seeing that reverberated for decades, enhanced in subsequent details with fresh and insightful theorizing by feminist art historians, critics, and aestheticians. His mantra was, men act and women appear, as he set the stage for the future. Here's a quote from John Berger. Men look at women women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor of woman in herself is male, the surveyed female. Thus, she turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight. End of quote. Women who fail to act then internalize the eyes of men upon them. They posed to be perceived, ultimately to please. They self-consciously silence themselves and still their bodies to be looked at, poised for pleasure. Artists who are considered masters and no longer extolled as creative geniuses in the production of masterpieces throughout the male-dominated history of art, due to feminist challenges, are the pleased and privileged lookers for centuries. Basing her theory within the analysis of film, Laura Mulvey argued that men look with a male gaze that is neither disinterested nor dispassionate, but rather projects its fantasy onto the female figure. I'm sure you're familiar with both Berger and Mulvey. I'll just give you a few highlights from her. Within film theory, the male director, actors, and spectators are all bearers of the active power of the erotic look, as she calls it, while the woman is image and spectacle, whose, quote, visual presence tends to work against the development of a storyline to freeze the flow of action in moments of erotic contemplation, close quote. The influential theory spawned much controversy when feminist theorists objected to the narrowness of a proposed gaze that failed to account for differences in race, ethnicity, class, and sexual orientation, embodied within the intersectionality of marginalized identities. At first, an alternative female gaze was proposed, but it was ambiguous in meaning. It sometimes captured how a woman, just like a man, had become habituated to look with a male gaze, while at other times it functioned as a gender-neutral gaze, particularly for women operating within what she called the male-controlled institutions of filmmaking. For some theorists, the concept of a patriarchal gaze better captured the culturally learned sexist, voyeuristic, white, middle-class, heterosexual, male-dominated, and male-gendered, though not necessarily male, mode of viewing woman as object. Additional strategies arose to subvert the norm of the male slash, I will just call it male patriarchal gaze, no slash between the two terms, such as the oppositional gaze proposed by bell hooks for Black women spectators who failed to identify with white women in popular film narratives. Another strategy that functions as a consciously adopted political perspective and means of resistance to the male gaze was Mary Devereaux's suggested notion of active readership, by which she meant a specific form of female gaze or female voice that encouraged a gendered spectator to engage more actively with the text by rereading, revisiting, and reading against the grain. Her definition was, reading against the grain is a strategy designed by out-of-power groups to counterbalance the dominant sexual traditions by offering alternative interpretations of works within those traditions. Thus, the evolving and complex notion of the male patriarchal gaze invites a deeper look into how we in the 21st century view beautiful female athletes' bodies, particularly in light of recent trends within fashion and sports media that have brought together high art photographers with Playboy and ESPN magazine to habituate our looking into newly adopted perceptual skills and responses that chronicle our changing perceptions of beauty. Moreover, the subject matter of sport forces viewers to acknowledge gender, race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, as well as disability, as athletes of color challenge norms of white beauty, Paralympians compete with prostheses, and transgender categories expand. By 1981, successful fashion photographer Helmut Newton had created a series of images as a testament to the shift in subject matter that bridged the fine art versus fashion photography divide. On the left, the female subjects in his series were notoriously not thin, anorexic, or ideal fashion models of the 60s, 70s, like British teenage supermodel Twiggy, pictured on the right, named for her thin figure, short hair, and androgyny. Rather, these women aspired toward neither fashion nor adornment. In fact, they were so strong in body and mind due to rigorous training routines that they were sports world contenders, in running events and marathons. Featured first in Sports Illustrated and then in an essay titled Strong Women, the Super Athlete as the New Ideal of Grace and Beauty. The example on the left is Gail Olenikova, Canadian sprinter and marathon runner, who said, quote, "The Twiggy look is out. The Botticelli nude look is out. I feel my look is the look of the 80s. In a well-known image from 81, Newton focuses on the runner's legs, feet uplifted, as if ready to sprint. When she passed away in 2003, Los Angeles Times writer John Thurber attributed changed perceptions to her about individually cultivated female beauty and cultural views about allure and athleticism because of her chiseled muscular legs. He quoted her own claim, "Strength is beauty. I grew up in the 60s when it wasn't cool for a female to be athletic. The Twiggy look was in. Nobody wanted to have muscular legs and mini skirts. I was running even then." Another well-known female athlete shot nude working out in her studio by Newton was bodybuilder Lisa Lyons on the left. Having photographed fashion models nude, this was not a departure for Newton, except that Lyons was an athlete again, thereby setting another new standard, which was hardly noticed in the fashion world and world of fine art. Bodybuilders have played an interesting but marginal role in the history of women in elite professional and Olympic sports, functioning as usually the inappropriate outer limit of female body mass and muscle. A male-dominated heterosexual sports world has routinely proscribed images of female athletes to remain within a narrow range of femininity, in that muscles due to steroid use make them appear masculine, butch, and threateningly lesbian, considered unappealing role models for young girls. Another way to regulate femininity, which caught on within sports culture, whereby female athletes prove their heterosexuality and attractiveness to men, was to be viewed erotically. At first, resemblance to highly sexualized and borderline pornographic depictions of women were unacceptable. But the norms of beauty were slowly beginning to change, along with viewers' tolerance for bodies like that of Lisa Lyons. On the cover of its August 30th, 1982 issue with the headline, "Coming on Strong, the New Ideal of Beauty," Time magazine placed a thin, bony, hand on her hip, long-haired woman posed in leggings, but showing no sweat. Today's students laugh at the sight of her. The airbrushed arms lack muscle. She actually appears unfit to them. She looks directly at the viewer in a coming on strong way, but in reality does nothing but pose. In May 1996, famed photographer Annie Leibovitz shot both color and black and white photos of 61 of America's most promising male and female athletes, called the New Olympians, posed together in group shots, as well as running, throwing, and vying for a chance to compete in the Summer Olympics in 1996, Atlanta. Thoughtful compositions, manipulation of lights and shadows, and the skillful exposure of muscles at work made for highly artistic portraits by professional photographer in Vanity Fair, a popular venue. The photo spread was considered new subject matter for the accomplished artist, who had already photographed fashion models, celebrities, and other famous persons. The depictions of athletic competitors lifted them to a level of high art, above that of the fashion model and sports jock. This publicity started a trend of treating athletes more seriously as fashion models or as fine art models, reminiscent of ancient Greek statues. Many of the bodies on display were shown in action shots, incorporating each athlete's signature talent as essential to his or her official portrait. Keep these in mind by Annie Leibovitz, because we'll look at images, more recent images of her, of Simone Biles from 2020. In June 96, the New York Times Magazine did a cover feature entitled "Women Muscle In," an Olympics special issues, with an article by Holly Brubeck, the style editor of the magazine, that was entitled "The Athletic Aesthetic, a Different Kind of Beauty." In that article, Brubeck wrote, "Now that women are physically coming into their own, there's a new ideal emerging whose sex appeal is based on strength." Her examples included volleyball player Gabrielle Reese on the right and basketball star Cheryl Swoops on the left, noticeably a woman of color. Remember, this is 96. Bruback claimed that throughout history, women were allowed only two types of body options. The first was a body custom built for clothes, an image of women as they would like to see themselves, the fashion model. The second option was a body custom built for sex, a vision, quote, a vision of women as men would like to see them, as exemplified by languorous, passive, and complacent odalisques in the Victoria's Secret catalog, who routinely denied themselves food to stay thin. As she wrote, the fashion body is an achievement arrived at by means of renunciation. It is the paradigm of an aesthetic of purity. Their looks are outward evidence, not of what they've done, but what they haven't done. With the Olympic Games pending, she cited a third new option, a body custom built for athletics, a different kind of beauty that was unsettling, far-reaching, and despite the anxieties it provokes, also sexy. She cited the unique Condé Nast publication, Self. There was a magazine started in '79 called Self, which unlike their other magazines, Vogue, Mademoiselle, and Glamour, capitalized on the emerging focus on women's exercise, thereby creating a science, what they called a science of aerobics in 1979, and resulting in a new medical interest in aesthetics of the female body. So women's self-image was now focused on building muscle. Indeed, the phrase women muscle in was meant to convey that there's no stopping the spreading fitness craze, as well as the bodily changes in elite level female athletes. Women were not asking for permission. They were demanding their space to grow and muscle up. If someone happened to snap their portrait in the process, they paid no attention. As she says, quote, caught in the act of biking, running, jogging, training for a marathon, triathlon, they look as if they refuse to stop long enough to have their pictures taken. These women exude competence. Their bodies aren't the point. Their point is the ability to perform. And I will return to that quote later. Thus, Bruback, as style editor, captured a crucial notion that proved essential to updating our conceptions of perceiving a beautiful body. The athletic body not toned or sculpted for looks to be seen, but rather for skill, speed, efficiency. This observation marked a new and evolving athletic aesthetic, as deeply steeped in physical capabilities and competition, and as far as possible from fashion modeling, which was done for the sake of merely showing off an article of clothing or accessory. It was also independent of men's approval. Quote, the image of a muscular woman has been particularly slow to gain currency, Bruback said, perhaps because women's gain is suspected of being men's loss, close quote. A different kind of beauty, athletic beauty, risked displeasing men, as it was not meant to be sexy, intended for the male patriarchal gazer alone. These athletes began to exude competence, their bodies taking on toned physiques, as women viewers began to look differently at muscular women who competed with skill and stamina in order to flaunt their athleticism, not just their looks. Also in July '96, hope you enjoy this one, Life magazine published a special issue designated with different covers to increase the sales of the magazine of images of both men and women entitled Naked Power, Amazing Grace, with a photographic celebration of the Olympic body by Joe McNally, photographer Joe McNally, and another accompanying essay by Lisa Grunwald, A Meditation on Athletic Beauty. In unprecedented manner, Naked Power referred to the fact that all athletes featured were nude. And as Grunwald reminded readers regarding the first Olympic athletes in 776 BC, all athletes were nude. Their bodies discreetly posed, as you can see here, or captured in motion, revealing little that was sexually explicit, but powerfully provocative. What accounted for the seismic shift that prompted both men and women to shed their uniforms? The highest aesthetic judgment of athletic beauty was now explicitly bestowed upon posed and performing performers of the men's water polo team, as well as female synchronized swimmers, 8-time Olympic gold medalist Carl Lewis, 3-time Olympic heptathlon champion Jackie Joyner-Kersee. These were famous Olympians. Men came to resemble women who had routinely posed nude only in non-sports, viewing traditions of high art, fashion photography, or a venue previously untapped pornography. The wholesome context of Life magazine clearly provided a safe context whereby the athletes felt comfortable. Thus, gender equity in terms of the mode of representation, photo shoots appearing in mainstream publications such as Vanity Fair, the New York Times Magazine, and Life magazine featured both sexes and became acceptable. But it occurred against the backdrop of an alternate trend that was already growing and generating controversy. The unprecedented practice of female athletes posing nude in traditional sports media and pornographic settings. It began in 1994 with swimmer Jenny Thompson on the eve of the Sydney Olympic Games, appearing in Sports Illustrated with only her fists covering her breasts. You can see their logo in the upper left, Sports Illustrated. It was followed by gold medalist figure skater Katarina Witt posing nude in 1998 in Playboy, long after she finished competing, and again in 2004 in Playboy, which included 12 pages of spectacular nudes in a section titled The Women of the Olympics that included high jumper Amy Akoff. Somebody's, if somebody could mute, I think we're getting noises through from somebody's speaker. Thank you. Few sports props got in the way of the female anatomy pictured, and if no clue appeared at all, this is 2004, the image revealed nothing of the athlete's sport. Moreover, a noticeable change had transitioned the positioning and posing of the athletes' actively engaged bodies to more sexualized porn-like postures. The most eroticized pose was Katie Vermeulen, on her knees, leaning back with her hands on her heels in order to point her breasts upward. She looked directly out at, well, there's another shot of her, directly out at the viewer in a standard come hither pornographic look. Other standard sexualized poses were adopted by Americans Mary Saar, Haley Clark. Several of these athletes had already posed nude or near nude for men's magazines, FHM, Stuff, and Maxim, and at least two later failed to qualify for Olympic competition, but nonetheless posed in these venues. Given the longstanding pornographic context of publications like Playboy, feminists whose job was to support and promote female athletes were very divided about these venues. Even posing in Sports Illustrated was controversial given its history since 1963 of sexualizing women in their annual swimsuit issue. Donna Lopiano, I'll cut this a little short. Donna Lopiano, then executive director of the Women's Sports Foundation, lamented any exposure in a sports magazine that minimizes athletic achievement and skill and emphasizes the female athlete as a sex object is insulting and degrading. On the other side, in response to the Playboy spread, world famous record-holding distance swimmer Diana Nyad said, "I braced myself for depressing cheesecake, but instead found 12 elegant, full-page photographs of female Olympians who are decidedly more athletic than they are sexy, or rather, they are both athletic and sexy, the new sexy." Nyad, like Brubeck before her, could not abandon the term sexy. Charlene Weaving, a philosopher, has analyzed many reactions to the contentious visual history of women Olympians posing nude. This is from an essay of hers, Like Beauty, Exploitation is in the Eye of the Beholder, an examination of women Olympic athletes posing nude from 2002. She argued that, like beauty, exploitation is in the eye of the beholder by comparing analogous representations of nude women within the context of porn designed for the sexual arousal of a man. She distinguished tasteful, the concept tasteful, from more typical poses in Playboy in which athletes are posed lying down, submissive, passive, assuming sex kitten poses of erotic body positions and gestures. Her reading of Gabrielle Reese's Playboy cover here in January 2001 elicited the statement, "The male gaze is definitely present in all shots." In spite of athletes' stated reasons to the contrary, she argued, when women athletes pose nude, their talent and incredible skill are trivialized because they are sexually objectified. Weaving defined objectification of the sexist, oppressive sort by invoking Martha Nussbaum's sex and social justice definition, involving instrumentality, treating the object as a tool, denial of autonomy and self-determination, inertness, lacking in agency, fungibility, interchangeability with others, violability, lacking in boundary integrity, ownership, can be owned, bought or sold, and denial of subjectivity. Noting that Nussbaum's criteria allowed for degrees of objectification and was not always unwelcome on the part of women who freely consented, Weaving was still moved to judge certain images of female Olympians posing nude as sexually objectified, problematic, and grounded in skepticism. In spite of these controversies over breakthrough representations in sport and fashion, however, our expectations and perceptions have undeniably changed. Whereas we as viewers in 2004 might have been shocked by elite athletes posing nude in Playboy, we have since grown accustomed to sexualized images of athletes rather than images of them performing their sports. It was only 5 years later that ESPN leveled the playing field, so to speak, by featuring numerous nude athletes, female and male, in a new sports publication. It was annual. I think they have since suspended it, that celebrated their athletic feats and beautiful bodies. ESPN, The Body Issue, significantly changed viewers' perceptions when it began in 2009. With internet access, perhaps there is no greater distributor of images of nude athletes' bodies as this commercial source. Over the past 11 years, production has become more sophisticated, slick, and successful. Showcasing athletes who are tattooed, like Colin Kaepernick, and disabled and pregnant, the venue highlights numerous athletes amidst galleries. They call them galleries of photographs taken by numerous artists. For instance, the 2019 issue offered 12 shots of Scout Bassett, a 30-year-old, 4'9" female sprinter and jumper weighing in at 89 pounds. Bronze medal winner of the 2017 Para Athletics World Championship in the 100-meter and long jump, and 2016 Paralympian, who competes with a prosthetic leg, performing chin-ups, deadlifts, and running. Given expanding changes in perception over the years, how do we now perceive beautiful female athletic bodies, particularly within the context? Let's move on now to Somaesthetics. Section 2, the Somaesthetics context for athletic bodies. Influenced by the pragmatist tradition of William James and John Dewey, esthetician Richard Schusterman began in 1992 to systematically construct a conceptual framework within philosophy in general and within philosophical aesthetics in particular that was intended to celebrate the living, sentient body as the organizing core of experience. This field of analysis was initially defined as the critical, ameliorative study of one's experience and use of one's body as a locus of sensory aesthetic appreciation and creative self-fashioning to address a long-standing neglect of the internal aspects of the human body within aesthetics. Somaesthetics claims that the body deserves more careful aesthetic attention, not only as an object that externally displays beauty, grace, and other aesthetic qualities, but also as a subjectivity that experiences aesthetic pleasures through somatic sensations. For Richard Schusterman, this is an aesthetics of renewal or revitalization of topics in art, aesthetics, and appreciation of the body, following its de-emphasis within postmodernism and Hegel's argument for the end of art, a moving away of aesthetic theorizing narrowly confined to compartmentalized fine art with little to no consideration given to actual bodies that experience art and attendant aesthetic pleasures. There is also significant conceptual turning away from modernist notions of autonomy, historical prioritizing of disinterestedness, and aestheticism's formalism. Somaesthetics both acknowledges, broadens, and privileges a person's aesthetic experience, both of the viewer and the body on display engaged in physical activity, and inclusively folds in studies as disparate as fashion, beauty, the art of living, hip hop, street art, cyberspace, and the human sciences. Schusterman stipulates 3 forms or categories within somaesthetics: the experiential, the representational, the performative. He also delineates 3 branches. I'm going to skip all those details. You can learn on your own about somaesthetics. 3 branches within somaesthetics: the analytic, the pragmatic, the practical. The phrase creative self-fashioning, a person's creative self-fashioning takes place within the practical realm, either for the purpose of an inner feeling of power or external exhibition, as he calls it, which is in reference to athletes and dancers. Clearly, athletes may pursue both goals. For them, it's not necessarily an exclusionary choice. The organizing structure of the newly defined field offers opportunities for further discussion to be pursued here as a helpful backdrop for advancing what I call the model of athletic agency as a new perceptual strategy that subverts the male patriarchal gaze by blocking objectification while encouraging self-care and an inner feeling of power for women, what he calls creative self-fashioning. I will skip some of my analysis of Schusterman. It will be in the printed version, of course. Somaesthetics is influenced by his longstanding feminist theorizing about the body, particularly when he talks about dance aesthetics. His most recent suggestion concerns dance aesthetics, whereby he urges us to look past the art object, the dance production, the dance theater or concert, or the dance work, toward greater concern with the embodied subjectivity who practices the art of dance, namely the dancers. Here's Martha Graham in 1940 performing what is called the kick. Within this context, Schusterman delves into Plato's writings on beauty, bodily excellence, to argue for dance as art, theater, and practice. However, because dancers perform works typically without a script or score, unlike theater or music, the dancers' bodies are perceived as constituting that artistic object, and the dancers in turn can quickly become objectified as bodies. As we have seen with depictions of athletes in Playboy and elsewhere, the problem of objectification, especially for women, is acute. Recall Nussbaum's criteria of objectification. It helps to differentiate not only the contexts of viewing, dance versus porn, but also the activity undertaken, active dancing versus passive posing. Moreover, the autonomy, agency, and subjectivity of the dancer are neither diminished nor surrendered, as the dancer chooses to be looked at fully and freely functioning as a performer. Schusterman eventually resolves his worry into a praiseworthy judgment of beauty, but further complicates the performance of the dancer, who is often relegated to a low status within the hierarchy of fine arts. He says, this objectification of the dancer as body, as material means of beauty for the specular pleasure of others, fosters the unsettling undercurrent of predatory voyeurism that haunts the milieu of dance spectatorship. Unfortunately, female athletes are once again linked to fraught histories of the imbalance of power perpetuated by viewers who can potentially see them as objectified and eroticized bodies. Does philosophy of sport offer any helpful frameworks for viewing female athletes' bodies of beauty? 2 authors, one invoking ancient Greece and another reviving neoclassical models from the 19th century, offer important touchstones on gender and modes of viewing that preview my model of athletic agency in the final section. This one will be short. So again, I can't cover every field. This is philosophy of sport and past theories of aesthetic beauty. I'm going to quote Heather Reed. Heather Reed has written incredibly important work on both Greek art, Greek sport, philosophy of sport, and contemporary sport. She analyzes philosophical texts that are instructive in demonstrating that in ancient Greek, seeing the body of an athlete, such as that portrayed in Polyclitus's spear bearer or Myron's discus thrower, she claims that, let me go back one slide. It involves seeing the whole body and seeing the whole person, a drive to win a competition as well as to achieve virtue and serve as a good citizen of the city-state. Careful readings of Plato's elaborate instructions for how local gymnasia should benefit a young boy to grow strong and be educated in Athenian ways, including specific recommendations for hard work, practice, and exemplary sportsmanship. In comparing the spectacle of opposed Usain Bolt, intentionally imitating a spear-wielding statue of a Greek god like Zeus or Poseidon, she asks the following questions in this journal article. What did the Greeks see? What did it mean to them? How was it erotic? And then she adds, what about female athletes? She says, the Greeks saw muscle, proportion, symmetry, canonical athletic beauty, but also virtue, indicative of the moral and educational ideal of beautiful goodness of the whole person, body and soul, whereby beauty symbolized the values of Aristotelian ethics, the good, arete. Talking about Olympic athletes and elite athletes of recent years posing nude, she says, I will stop short of claiming that athletic females were sexualized in ancient Greece the way many of them are in modern sports iconography. There is nothing in ancient athletic art that remotely resembles the favored beach volleyball photograph of a bent over woman's behind, a pose that closely resembles pornographic images. So she offers, she's not the only one, Charlene Weaving, as I said, also writes about this topic, an analysis of female athletic bodies that is negative and worrisome. Looking at contemporary athletes raises questions beyond obvious similarities to images we see in fashion, past sports media, and examples from ancient art, raising the question, do we perhaps view nude athletes as we view nude bodies within works of art? Take a look at this example. We have been trained to look at art. Art history offers us a veritable flood of depictions of nude women painted nearly exclusively by male artists over many millennia. They are the artistic canon of masterpieces of high art. For instance, Botticelli, there's a detail on the left here of Botticelli's Primavera. Here is the entire shot. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. So let me work backwards a little bit from that. As with film theory, the charge of viewing nude female bodies within a male patriarchal gaze has been leveled at the creators and viewers of art historical icons as well. Sorry, I touched it, this thing, sorry. Consider a challenge to the tradition. This is a provocative depiction of WNBA athlete Liz Cambage by photographer Sophie Holland in the 2019 ESPN body issue. She is posed as, I think, this is my interpretation, the three graces of Botticelli's Primavera from 1482, the three graces being charm, beauty, and creativity. There they are with their hands together, although they are three separate but very similar looking female white bodies. And again, 1482 from a very large painting by Botticelli. Sports fans with little experience in viewing fine art might be uninterested, but those of us with years of looking at art in galleries, art history books, online, museums might ask, what, if anything, is different in how I perceive a performing body versus an artistic representation of such? Time precludes delving into the issue here, but of course, dance scholars are primarily apt at thinking about bodies as performers, and philosophers of sport have routinely written about athletic bodies in many sports as similar to performing dancers. Our goal here is to pursue the question posed within the particular framework of Somaesthetics, namely, how do we perceive beautiful female bodies while avoiding the problem of objectification? How do we honor Schusterman's goal of perceptual appreciation toward the goal of their self-cultivation and enrichment, as he calls their creative self-fashioning? The photographer Sophie Holland has demonstrated an ongoing interest in portraying athletic women like Cambridge, not only with her work for ESPN, but also with portraits published in a volume entitled Strong Like Her, a celebration of rule breakers, history makers, and unstoppable athletes. That came out in 2020. Her images reinforce self-cultivation over exploitation, enrichment, over objectification. So I would recommend her book as a way of looking, or her images online, as ways of seeing other sorts of images as the Cambridge. As Brubeck hinted back in 1996, these women exude competence. Is this a model for how we should view female athletes? I'm skipping a whole section on the philosopher of sport scholar Jesus Ilandain Agaruza, who wrote Athletic Bodies and the Bodies of Athletes, a critique of sporting build in 2008, a very classic essay that talks more about male bodies. We'll just focus on female bodies primarily here. Section 4, final section, Perceiving Female Beautiful Bodies, the Athletic Agency Model. In light of the changing standards of beauty, evolving models of athletic bodies, and the impetus of analyzing sports within a context of somaesthetics, I suggest a new feminist challenge to the male patriarchal gaze. What I call a model of athletic agency for perceiving beautiful bodies, particularly those of female athletes. Inspired by a video running in my head, I can see an athlete in motion or between movements as she competes with an agentic body, with the term agentic referring not only to the potential, but the actuality of an athlete acting as the agent in control of her doing, acting, full-bodied engagement in competition. This notion of agency, influenced by insights from Diana Myers, suggests that cultural imagery dominated by patriarchal oversight can be neutralized, that's her term, or resisted by women. How? Through self-knowledge, self-definition, and self-esteem. Diana Myers' book, Gender in the Mirror, Cultural Imagery and Women's Agency, came out in 2002. Wresting control of representations of their bodies that are misread as hypersexualized, objectified, and exploitative is precisely what some female athletes seek to attain. When Myers encourages skills that enable women to, quote, express their feelings and ideas openly, to interact respectively, to reflect intelligently, and to judge conscientiously, as well as to resist detrimental interpretations effectively, she is recommending the development and implementation of agentic skills that put women in touch with themselves and enable them to discern what they really want and care about, and enable women to improvise ways to express their own values and goals, both in the medium of speech and in that of action. Assigning agency displaces and repudiates the passiveness of a woman, purportedly posed for the male patriarchal gaze, who is vulnerable to the sexual predator, surrendering to his desire. Agency embodies all the traits that feminists encourage in terms of resistance to patriarchal norms, namely acting for oneself and or for others, and engaging. In the case of sport, this includes competition, often alongside teammates. Unlike the traditional male patriarchal gazer of a woman posed in an artistic masterpiece, the model of athletic agency relocates a perceiver's attention on the performer of action that presupposes her preceding and subsequent agentic accomplishments. Such actions may take place before the still shot or after, but any still shot presumes a continuum, a series of images of a woman in motion. This model suggests that a viewer freeze frame the video of the athlete at play, setting up for a dunk or stripping down to her sports bra after the scoring the winning goal, recalling the Brandi Chastain removal of her soccer jersey in 1999, which caused an uproar because she took off her top, stripped down to her bra. In effect, we recall, intuit, or imagine athletes and athletes' past actions, which we may have actually witnessed or not, as well as possible future actions. Capturing her body on record, as Bruback suggested, is the athlete caught in the act of biking, running, jogging, training, looking as if they refuse to stop long enough to have their picture taken. This is easily discerned when an athlete is caught in motion, caught in action. Yet I contend the model of athletic agency is also a viable strategy for perceiving bodies, even when an athlete is posed provocatively, say for Playboy, since it is still the case that, as Bruback said back in 1996, quote, their bodies aren't the point is their ability to perform, close quote. This may spark some discussion on our part in the next section. Posing like porn stars, however, jeopardizes the primacy of agency. It diverts gazers' attention away from athletic agency towards sexiness. Their bodies are the point in virtue of their ability to perform at the highest levels of skill and competition, since motion has been stopped and the still likeness captured. But these athletes lose our full attention as we are distracted by the competing provocative sexual pose. This capturing of arrested motion in time is suggested by Jason Holt in a new book, Kinetic Beauty, under the rubric Frozen Moment, in which a static sportistic artwork presents a frozen structured moment divorced from, but still part of the dynamic athletic event. This came out in 2020. His paradigm example is Myron's Discobolus, whose athleticism would never be questioned because he is both a strong male and is stopped mid-throw. But the unmet challenge, I contend, is to extend his easy analysis of a male athlete to that of an elite female athlete who risks prompting a sexualized response, presumably by a viewer with a male patriarchal gaze. The agency of the athlete is at stake and must be taken seriously. Contributing to the problem, data from the past 25 years has consistently shown that televised sports and Sports News and ESPN Sports Center have routinely failed to publicize women's athletic achievements, opting instead to show them in relationship to men as mothers, wives, or girlfriends, or in humorous situations. The new athletic agency model of perception incorporates changes in both athletes' ability to pose, availability to pose, and to be photographed for the media and public, as well as changing ways of viewing, from the dominating and possessive male patriarchal gaze to looking at a body with full awareness of the sport context in which that performing body appears. Looking at beautiful bodies of posed nude female athletes in any context is only superficially like looking at paintings of nude women in so-called masterpieces by male artists throughout art history. They may appear similar, but knowledge of the athlete's accomplishments, her actions before and after the pose, and her agentic control of athletic feats makes all the difference at a deeper level of perception, our cognitive processing. The same observation applies to comparing athletes to posers in porn. The background information we bring to the perceptual process separates the athletes from the sex workers. As Mary Devereaux contended back in 1995, observation is always conditioned by perspective and expectation. This is from her canonical article, Oppressive Text Resisting Readers in the Gendered Spectator. Of course, as well as with all art and visual imagery, the possibility of misinterpretation exists. This happened with explicit sexual imagery of feminist artists in the 70s and 80s, such as the vaginal imagery of Judy's Chicago dinner party. And it can happen with male athletes posing nude. Male athletes take a different sort of risk when operating within the macho world of male athletics, where one should only be pictured strong in action, and decisively engaged in athletics. Male athletes risk being interpreted as overly concerned with their looks, stripping down for other men to look and enjoy. But do they risk being viewed as passive, objectified sex objects? Devereaux defines objectification as merely making someone or something the object of my gaze. Aestheticization means treating people or things as objects of aesthetic contemplation. Men like Richard Gere in the film American Gigolo have thus been objectified, eroticized, and aestheticized, but they have not experienced what she says is degradation by being demeaned or debased, denied dignity and respect, or devalued. It is with respect to actual degradation that the asymmetry between men and women reappears. I contend male athletes simply do not risk being misread as do females. Moreover, social norms and perceptions have already changed so much, enough, so that few would misread, oops, went the wrong way. Few would misread Colin Kaepernick's tattooed body as anything other than an accomplished, strong Black man and Super Bowl champion. His posing expanded the array of bodies to be looked at, and we were able to recall his throwing arm. In my theory of the model of agency, we can recall his throwing arm and anticipate his next game, if ever in the NFL, as we view his body on display. Part of that continuum of imagery. I am reminded that Richard Schusterman defined art as a form of dramatization in the sense of putting an object or action in a special frame or scene that magnifies the significance of that object or action by its framing focus. This characterization brings us back full circle to Somaesthetics and the role of the performing body in both athletics and art. Freeze framing, an athlete stops his or her agency in time, but only artificially, long enough for an enlightened perceiver to savor and enjoy, i.e. to see, perceive, and appreciate the self-fashioning and personal enrichment of the athlete in Somaesthetic terms. My last example and most recent shows the complexity of this process. Recall Annie Leibovitz's successful photo shoot back in 1996 of Olympic athletes, in contrast to her recent 2020 cover shoot of Olympic gymnast Simone Biles. The reaction was incredible to this shoot. Some challenged Vogue magazine to hire someone who better understands Black skin tones, was one quote, while others objected to the painterly way Leibovitz portrayed the athlete, the lackluster amid dark colors. Did Leibovitz belittle and degrade? How might we learn to portray women athletes with more perceptual appreciation of their self-fashioning in the future? So let me sum up a little and speculate for all the philosophers in the group and tie in a little bit to Kogsai. Only briefly. New work in cognitive science, the psychology and philosophy of perception, and philosophical theorizing about the role of prior knowledge can play a promising role in the next stage of more deeply improving what happens when we perceive, interpret, and judge. We already know from studies of the well-known duck-rabbit picture, one of my favorites, that seeing or thinking in advance about a duck or rabbit can play a role in deciding between incompatible readings of ambiguous figures. We are also aware that perceptual sexism, a term invented by me and my husband, Ed Weiser, in an article that came out in 2016 in Body Aesthetics, edited by Sherry Irvin. We are also aware that perceptual sexism, which is another form of implicit bias, can be a barrier to informed and fair perception when viewing an athlete such as Caster Semenya on the far right, world-class runner, accused of looking like a man, which disqualified her at age 17 from a full year of international competition. Studies that show artists, coming back to Kogsai, studies now show that artists perform better than non-artists on not only drawing tasks, but also on strictly visual tasks, prompting the question as to whether artists are more aptly able to perceive athletes' bodies. Eye movement patterns of so-called art experts, new term we're talking about in Kogsai, experts, when viewing an unfamiliar picture, differ from eye movement patterns of novices, indicating specific perceptual, not cognitive skills. Can such skills be learned? Mohan Mathan suggests such skills are abilities that are acquired by repeated trying, although some are acquired by mere exposure. This is from a 2015 article, Play Skill and the Origins of Perceptual Art. Perhaps it's not just perceptual noticing, but rather the allocation of one's attention differently, argues Kevin Connolly, Perceptual Learning and the Contents of Perception in 2014. Some contend that perceptual attention is a genuine perceptual phenomenon, a perceptual skill that can be developed into an expertise. This is Stokes and Nanay in Perceptual Skills. Finally, still untapped are possible gender and racial differences in perception as well. For instance, studies show that there are subtle differences between men and women and their judgments of art. That is, what women want is, among other things, quality in art, and they are better judges of art. Again, very contentious claims. I can steer you later to the research. Also, stereotypes arise. For example, that Black female athletes are more athletic than white female athletes, and that we can learn to fairly process those images, particularly when comparing them. So there's a lot of research being done as well. These avenues hold promise for understanding more fully how we perceive a beautiful female athlete's body and how we can train ourselves to perceive more immediately and clearly that agency is at the heart of the physical, the soma, as Richard Schusterman calls it, that we enjoy. More nuanced examinations of the concept of pleasure, oh boy, are they in order? Since pleasure is often tied to male sexual pleasure or voyeuristic pleasure. Finally, Somaesthetics and its overlap and interaction with fashion sports, the philosophy of sport, feminist film theory, feminist philosophy and aesthetics, and Kogsai welcomes many contenders onto the playing field. It points the way to a future where perceiving beautiful bodies, particularly female athletes' bodies, can be a more skilled and rewarding experience. Here's my last shot of Simone Biles. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.